Welcome to Module 1. Our first guest is Ed Sims, President and CEO of WestJet. Ed joined WestJet in 2017 as the Executive Vice President of Commercial and became President and CEO in 2018. In 2019, Ed led the organization through the largest private equity deal in aviation history with the purchase of WestJet by Onyx. Ed started in the United Kingdom travel industry and has enjoyed a varied career spanning more than 30 years in tourism and aviation across the European, Australian, and North American markets. Prior to WestJet, Ed held senior commercial and operational leadership positions within Thomas Cook and Virgin Groups and served for 10 years at Air New Zealand, where he led the international wide-body business. Ed's role prior to WestJet was marked by 6 years of service as the CEO of Airways, New Zealand's air navigation service provider, air traffic controllers. In this module, you're going to hear from Ed, the CEO of one of Canada's largest airlines. He shares lessons he's learned throughout his career, the importance of knowing who you are as a leader, and staying true to your authentic self. So, let's get started. Find a quiet place. Don't worry about how your day has been so far, and don't worry about what you have to do later. Just be here right now. Be present, and allow yourself the opportunity to really learn from this incredible leader. It's a very rare opportunity. Take it, you deserve it.
Okay, the first thing that we would like to know is, can you tell us about your journey? How do you go from, you're this kid in high school, are you already loving aviation back then? And then did you lie awake in bed and think, I'm going to be the CEO one day?
There's no correct answer to that. So I didn't have the kind of Jet A1 in my nostrils. I came from a fairly remote part of South Wales, fairly not very affluent parental background. So the first time I ever flew was when I was 17. And the second time I ever flew was when I was 21 and I was actually working for an airline. So I'm not one of those kids who could spot aircraft or, recognize aircraft or hang around at the edge of a runway. What I really wanted to do was escape. So I grew up in quite a kind of industrial background that I really was quite keen to get away from as quickly as possible. So I started life as a check-in agent at Gatwick Airport, south of London. And why did I end up in that? Because there was something about travel, there was something about aviation that was completely alien to me and to my family, and I didn't understand it. And I thought it was an environment that was going to be really challenging and taxing. What I really loved in my early stages of my career was just trying to understand what made customers, or guests as we call them in WestJet, what made them tick and what made them buy certain things, read certain newspapers, buy products and not other products. And that's what I found fascinating working at an airport. Was I was just a kind of inveterate people watcher. And I'm always interested in behavior. So I've kind of dabbled in psychology, but you can't work in aviation, I think, and not be interested in psychology and not be interested in what makes people make the decisions that they do. And that's why I ended up staying in it. But did I dream of being a chief exec? No, but I've always ended up taking the lead on conversations. So if there's something controversial or something that people have left unsaid, even in school, I was the kid who'd say it. And I don't know why that was the case. And it probably ended up, me getting thumped in the playground a few times for saying things I probably shouldn't have said. But I really struggle where people I know have strong opinions and things to say, and they don't feel confident to use your word, or they don't feel empowered to actually share those comments or say those comments. So I ended up being the person who would always say that. And sometimes it can make you sound opinionated or uh, deliberately liking the sound of your own voice. But it just felt to me that if somebody had to say something or somebody had to raise something, even if it was controversial in the workplace, it needed to be said. And so I ended up taking a kind of a leadership, or being seen as someone who was always comfortable about expressing their opinion. And that led me almost inevitably into leadership roles.
Wow, that's really interesting. So what do you say then to people who don't feel comfortable to express their opinions? I mean, I know even for me, I've been in conversations with people, and they're giving me their opinion, and I sort of hold back because I don't want to get into that confrontation. And I know there's a lot of other people here that,
Yeah.
have felt that way. How do you get over that?
So the first thing I will say when somebody says, "Hey, I'd really like you to say such and such," the first thing you obviously say is, "Why don't you say that?" And when you get to the basis of why people don't want to put their hands up, if they genuinely have a phobia or are frightened of a reaction, then I'll say, "I'm saying this on Kendra's behalf," or "I'm saying this on Alexia's behalf." Or if they really want that to be totally anonymous, I need to get to the bottom of why they feel frightened. Is it retribution? Is it unpopularity? And I guess, one of the key lessons for me is that I will always say to people, when you're the person who's asking that question, you're there to be respected, not liked. And, one of the key, we'll come on to one of the few, one of the comments that people know me for within WestJet, or that people knew me for Air New Zealand, is when you take a position, you have to say to people, "I'm not here to tell you what it is I think you want to hear. I'm here to tell the truth." And as long as you are giving a true version of events, frankly, I've gone beyond worrying whether people like that, to hear that version of events. As long as I know that I'm being authentic and that I'm being honest and that I'm being direct, then you start to worry less about how will this land with people, and you start to think more about how am I helping people and how is this helping people make better life decisions.
So that really leads into one of the other questions that we have about being authentic as a
Yeah.
leader. We were talking last night about that, and it came up like, how do you be authentic as a leader? Like, especially if you're lower on the leadership rank and you're not as confident as maybe you would be. How do you find that, and how do you stay authentic?
Yeah. Look, I'm not I'm not remotely confident as a person. Uh,
Oh,
I'm an introverted leader. If I'm given the choice between networking at a function with 100 people or sitting at home and studying for what comes next, I'll choose the sitting at home. I guess my parents were academics, and I was kind of used to working on my own and studying on my own. But there are a couple of tests, I think, around for me that are important for me about authenticity, and I should have given everyone on the call tonight my usual health warning. I suffer really badly from imposter syndrome, and the idea of me giving a masterclass on leadership, frankly, I find quite bizarre, because I'm not an academic, I'm not a guru. I've just learned from difficult situations, and I've learned how I've responded in difficult situations. But back to a couple of tests on authenticity. One, which is for me is absolutely critical, and I just don't find you can function without it, is to actually take the time to write your personal values and think about those personal values. You cannot waste a word in your personal values. So I can tell you mine pretty much off the bat. They are around authenticity, that word you used earlier. They're around remaining aspirational. They're around remaining really humble. They're around resilience. And, Lord knows, there's never been a greater test of resilience than in the last 8 months. And I think you test your personal values, and then you test them against the organization that you're working for. And the lovely thing for me at WestJet is my values are quite different to the way WestJet expresses their values, but they actually mesh together really well. So you're being authentic when you speak on behalf of an organization, when you know that your personal values fit really well with your company's values. So the company's values are about working together to win, rising to a challenge. And I just really resonate with those values. Emma and I played a part in the creation of the values. That helps, obviously, but I didn't write them. They were written by thousands of WestJetters, but they really sit well with me and they sit well with my personal values. So I think that's one way, Kendra. The other way that I think is every bit as important is when you write or when you speak, as I'm often asked to speak, you've got to try and make sure that your voice sounds the same. So when I write, I used to write until COVID, I used to write a weekly blog to all of my staff. It was called Ed Talks. You know, it's really funny. I found that a really amusing pun. Nobody else found it. Yeah, nobody else found it funny. But I used to send it out to the company 8 o'clock every Friday without fail. I mean, like if it went out at 8:01, I'd have a tantrum with myself. But it had to go at the same time every week so that people were kind of expecting it. But I like really simple language, you know, and I like short sentences. So I try and ensure that I'd write exactly as I'd speak. So when I finished writing it, I'd actually read it back to myself to make sure that it's actually sounded like it came from me, like it wasn't ghost written or curated, which I hate with a passion. But it had to feel like it was actually in my accent. And that's one way you can be authentic, because there's nothing worse than people, I think, being a different parent or a different person in private to the person they are in work. And there's nothing worse than people sounding highfalutin or academic in their written word. And then when you meet them and you hear their spoken word, you think, oh my God, they sounded like a totally different person. That's really disappointing.
Well, that almost goes against what I've heard. And I feel the same way you do about this, but I have heard other people say they have to be different at work because they're a manager and they need to portray something different. How do you feel about that?
I see, I don't agree with that. I do think going to work is theater. And I do think you have to put on stage makeup. So for me, it's a suit, you know, and it's about dressing up as if I'm going to do something serious, which, you know, most people think running an airline is quite serious. But it doesn't mean you have to be a different person. And, you know, what was a really interesting exercise, I got asked by one of the financial analysts who follows aviation recently to imagine that I had my family in a vault next door to me and I had my executive team in the next vault. And they had to come up with one word that described me. So how would your family describe you versus how would your executive team describe you? And what blew me away and relieved me was that they almost used exactly the same word. So I asked them both. I asked my family to come up with one word and I asked my executive team. And my
Are we allowed to know the word? No.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, okay.
Well, you're not allowed to hear the rude words my family used against me because they were much crueler. But my family described me as courageous and my executive team described me as resolute and determined. And I'm okay with that because if my family had said, you know, oh, he's a real soft, fluffy guy, and the executive team had said he's a real hard ass, something for me would have gone wrong. So I like, personally, much as I love preparing for work and knowing that, you know, when I finish the drive to work, I'm going to be on stage and I'm going to be in the public domain. When I'm home, I like to know that I'm always consistent. Yeah. And it doesn't make you a very interesting person, but it makes you a very predictable person. And I think predictability is critical in leadership, because if people feel you're unpredictable, you're putting them on shifting sands. And I just don't think that's fair on people.
You know, I just want to ask everyone that's watching here right now, if you know what the imposter syndrome is and you have felt it or you feel it, can you raise your hand? Yeah. The imposter syndrome, like, I can't believe you mentioned that. I did a talk one time in Yellowknife and there was a man at the end of it who raised his hand and said, what's this imposter syndrome? And so I asked the ladies in the audience, I said, if you don't mind, raise your hand if you feel that way. And all the women raised their hand and the men were like, So I was actually quite surprised to hear you say the imposter syndrome.
Can I tell you a story about imposter syndrome? So when I was in, I guess you'd call it year 12 in school, and I was thinking about going to university, and I had a careers master, and he said, don't even think about applying for university because you're not smart enough and you won't get into university. So I kind of went, wow, I'm not too happy about that advice. So without the school's backing or the blessing, I wrote to Oxford University and I said, I'd like the papers for the application for the admission test. And without the school knowing, I sat the entrance exams and I got admitted. And for the first year that I was at Oxford, I wouldn't wander anywhere near their admissions office because I was convinced that somebody was going to shout out and go, are you Ed Sims? You're actually the wrong guy. There's a different Ed Sims who should have been admitted in your place. And I suffered so badly from imposter syndrome that I actually used to walk about half a mile around the admissions office to make sure that I didn't get called in. So they, so no one would realize they'd actually got the wrong guy. And so it's absolutely not a female phenomenon. There's a lot of guys struggle, and a lot of guys I know struggle with imposter syndrome. And I don't think it's a bad thing. It's a bad thing if it deprives you of the confidence to be the best version of the person you can be and you were meant to be. But it's not a bad thing if it grounds you and it keeps you humble.
Oh, that's a really good way to look at it. Okay, moving on. This time's going to go by way too fast. Okay, communication. Let's talk about communication. That was something else that came up last night. I know you're a great communicator. We've already talked about a little bit, especially with your Ed Talks. What importance do you put on communication, and what advice can you give to people to develop a good way to communicate?
So communication is not an interest or a hobby. It's a discipline. And the thing with communication, I think you look at your working week. Let's say you do a working week, I don't know, 40, 50 hours, doesn't matter. But you divide it up into percentages. And I look at communication and I say, it doesn't matter how long my working week is, 20% of my working week is going to be spent in communication. So if I'm going to do a 5-day working week, I'm going to spend a whole day either meeting with somebody over coffee or writing an Ed Talks or doing a company webinar or doing a town hall. But I will never let that be less than a day a week. I'll never let that be less than 20%. And I think with communication, you have to dedicate yourself to saying, this is going to be structured and the time is going to be allocated and I'm never going to lose that time. And, I think also, coming back to another personal mantra, you never ask someone to do a job that you couldn't do yourself. Now I have done most jobs in an airline. There are two things I can't do in an airline, and that distinguishes me from most of your audience tonight, because anyone in your audience tonight, anyone on this masterclass could do my job. I can't do most of your jobs. I don't have, my spatial reasoning is terrible. I could never be an ATC. I could never be a pilot. But any one of you, by putting your hand up for leadership and by taking a decision that you're prepared to live with a world where you might be quite lonely or quite unpopular, you can take that step, but you really have to be incredibly disciplined about how you divide your time. And I will not ask someone to do a job if I'm not prepared to do it myself. So hence why I think, as you know, Kendra, the executive team at WestJet will always operate as flight attendants when we fly without fail. Doesn't matter what I'm doing at the other end. If I'm going to give a presentation or I'm going to speak to shareholders or I'm speaking to bankers, I will operate that flight and I will recognize that I'm not going to be able to work on that flight. Once a month.
You really want to be on one of those flights, do you guys? Really? Like I want you to give me a coffee. No.
Well, it's quite funny because I'm so bad. But because I just spent all my time chatting to the guests in row 5 and 6, at the start of the economy class. I don't tend to work in premium because I'm just too messy with my service. But if you're in row 23, there's a good chance you're going to end up thirsty because I'm just really busy talking to people at the front of a flight. But lots of people post about it on social media, and it's hilarious that people go, "Oh my God, I had Ed Sims on my flight, and he served me a coffee," and I'm just thinking that's just what I do. It's just, but once a month we load bags. I go down to the contact center. There's nothing more grounding than sitting in a contact center and talking and listening to the questions that guests are asking about policy that you may have introduced. and you introduced this policy and you thought this would be a grand idea, and this feels like a really smart thing to do. And then you listen to guests going, what idiot came up with this idea? And you're thinking, oh, that was me. And you realize you have to, with every decision you make, if you're not making that decision by putting yourself in the recipient's shoes, then you're going to make a bad decision. And too many people, the airline industry, of course, is a safety industry. Of course, it's highly regulated, but it's a service industry. And I think people make really, really bad providers of service if they can't act and think like a customer.
Wow, you're so unique. Like, I know that not all leaders think the way you do. That is, I know we'll be talking about this the next hour for sure.
It just feels so common sense. It just feels, keep business simple. There's too much mystique talked about leadership and business, and it's a simple proposition.
I can tell that one of your values are being humble. It clearly comes through. Okay, I'm going to keep going because this one's really important. They're all important, but this one is also important. This was brought up yesterday as well, and it is a tough one. How do you delegate? Like you're talking about, I wouldn't give someone something I couldn't do myself, and like sort of leads into that. How do you delegate something that you have to delegate? Yeah, I mean, you're the CEO. All you have to do is snap your fingers, maybe. But
no, it doesn't work like that. Unfortunately, I wanted people in work to call me Your Excellency, because when I was running Airways New Zealand, I used to go and meet with the Saudi air traffic controllers, and my equivalent was always called Your Excellency, and always had someone around who would pour their individual coffee. And I thought this was a brilliant idea, but apparently it's not very Canadian, so nobody calls me Your Excellency, which was terribly disappointing to me. So I don't click my fingers. What I do is trust and verify. So when I trust somebody, I say to them, I want you to do X, Y, and Z, or I believe we should be undertaking A, B, and C, and I'm going to check in a week and see how that's going for you. So I don't believe in annual performance reviews. I do that every month. So if I think this afternoon I've been with my chief commercial officer and my chief operating officer, and I've been doing their monthly performance reviews, and I keep it really, really simple. I say, what were the 3 things you were working on last month? And what are the 3 things you're going to be focusing on next month? Because those are the 3 things I'm going to measure you on. And so I trust and verify and get other people to self-assess. I never, ever give people a performance rating, because I ask them to performance rate themselves. And if I disagree with them, I'll tell them. And I have as many disagreements where I think people have been too harsh on themselves, and I mark them up, as I do saying to somebody, hey, you're delusional and you're actually operating a level below you. But the really important aspect is not their final score, it's that they self-assess. And I think the key to delegation comes back to your own self-awareness and the people around you having self-awareness. And self-awareness can be coached, it can be counseled. I think it is possibly the most single important attribute of leadership. And it comes back again to your personal values and knowing where you are at your best and knowing where you're suboptimal, and actually encouraging people to own that and be honest about it. Because none of us are at our best 100% of the time. The challenge when you're a pilot and the challenge when you're an air traffic controller is, those times need to be ruled out, and, they need to be disciplined out. But when you're not actually sitting at your radar screen, or you're not on the flight management system, then just acknowledge that you can give yourself a little bit of mental downtime. But I just think it's, that aspect of self-awareness is probably the key that distinguishes people who will go on to leadership roles and those people who will quite happily continue to take instructions from others.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, how about, we have a specific example from someone last night. They're saying that they're a manager in IT in a company. How do you find your way out of that? Like, you're this manager in a department, and now you want to be a leader. And I know you've already said a number of things, but even drilling into it more specifically, like, what would this person do to expand herself and her role?
Yeah, that's cheapest. I could talk about that for the next half an hour. First of all, I think it's really important that people think of their careers not as a ladder. The career ladder is one of the biggest myths, the most dangerous myths that's ever been constructed in leadership. Careers are lattice works, and you're going to spend as much time stepping sideways on a lattice as you do going up. And sometimes you'll take 3 or 4 steps sideways for that upward move. So I think that's one thing is people are, I've come across so many people who are just so impatient and are so transparent about saying, I can only move up. And I'm far more interested in people who talk about, I'm really interested in moving sideways and broadening my career. So that's one point I would make. The second is, as someone who has responsibility or had responsibility until recently for 14,000 people, I can generally walk into a room and put questions to a group of people and see who puts their hands up. So if you're in a junior position in an IT department, or you're, a new approach controller or a new first officer, it's those people who put their hand up to say, actually, I'm really interested in talking about company culture, or I'm really interested in user experience, or I'm really interested in artificial intelligence or machine learning. I naturally gravitate to people who put their hands up. I tend to think that the world is divided into energy givers and energy vampires. And I spend most of my time trying to avoid energy vampires and spending my time with energy givers. And the less time you can give to vampires, the less time you get drained. And so I think that, the importance of volunteerism, the importance of understanding something that you need to take a sideways step is critically important. But it leads me on to another point, and I hate recommending books because I'm not a great reader of academic books. I tend to get bored fairly quickly. But there's a book called Range by a guy called David Epstein. And I didn't understand why the book resonated as much with me because it was lent to me by a friend who's an orthopedic surgeon in Calgary. And the reason the book resonated with me is he believes that the future belongs to the generalists, to the broad generalists, not to the technical specialists. And coming to Canada, this was something that I loved about when I lived and worked in Australia and New Zealand. Australia and New Zealand really believe in generalists. They believe if you're good enough, you're ready to be moved. So when you were giving my bio, which is all lies, by the way, and I made it all up, I had a boss back in 2003 when I was running the commercial side of Air New Zealand, and he said, have you ever thought of managing wide-body pilots and crew? And I went, why would I do that? That sounds like the idea of a nightmare. And he said, I'd love you to be effectively chief operating officer. I'd really like you to run the wide-bodied operations. And I was terrified, and I had no idea how to address pilots, like I say, whose job is, so far beyond my technical training. But what he was basically saying was, you need to be a generalist. You need to get out of your functional specialist. You're pretty good at alliances or running loyalty schemes or running sales campaigns. I'd like you to be as good at managing pilots and flight attendants. And I want you to learn labor relations, labor negotiations, and lead the line. So I went from managing about 80 people at the time to managing 4,500. And so I spent the first 6 months not sleeping. But then you gradually realize that essentially that's all about becoming, what I think of it as a T-shaped leader, not an I-shaped leader. So T-shaped leader goes as broad as they go deep. And Canada troubles me because Canada's corporate society is all about going deep, and it's all about technical specialism. And in Australia and New Zealand, they basically just go broad and they go wide. And they're two quite different disciplines. So for the person who thinks he or she is suffering by being stuck in IT, go broad. Just think about what you could put your hand up for that would make you surprise your management team by the breadth of skill that you're interested in, and just keep going broad.
like hearing that, because I think one of the things, and I don't know about the women here, but historically we hear that women in the room are less likely to put their hand up. For whatever reason, they're less likely to do it. And obviously you don't feel that way, that women should be less likely, like should put their hand up less. But just
Women
hearing
should
you
put
encourage people, I think.
women should put their hand up more, Kendra, because otherwise the only hands that go up are the alpha males in the room, and you end up with a room full of people who think and act like me. And that's why you get this whole generation of leadership that is rightly in many ways defined as pale, male and stale, because we're all carbon copies of each other. And if you don't have women putting your hand up, you get more of the same thinking. And I'm not just saying that for your audience. That is absolutely my experience. That if you don't have, and I know diversity and inclusion has become cliche, but if you haven't got diversity of opinion around the executive table, you tend to think that the whole world thinks and acts like you, which is disastrous.
Okay, we have just heard from our first guest. There's so many takeaways from Ed's class. One of the things that stuck out to me the most is when Ed spoke about being authentic as a leader and acknowledges that even he struggles to overcome the imposter syndrome. He believes it's absolutely critical to write out your own personal values. I encourage you now to take Ed's advice and really think about your own personal values. Who do you want to be as a leader, as a human? Write down your values and think about how you apply them both at work and in your everyday life. Take some time to do that and then come back as we join our next master speaker.